Hi, I'm Raymond Simonson. I'm the CEO of JW3, London's Jewish Community Centre and the UK's only Jewish arts and culture venue of its kind. Sadly, as you know, we've had to temporarily close our doors at the moment. We've got to think about people's health and safety, and we're listening to government advice. But just because we've stopped doing what we normally do in the way that we do it, it doesn't mean we have to completely stop what we're doing and what we're best at. And that is to increase the quality, variety and volume of Jewish conversation in London and beyond. So we've got some treats for you. We are going to put on a whole load of our digital archive that we've been building up over the last 6 years of some amazing events. We're going to make them absolutely free of charge to you. And whilst you sit down with a cup of tea and put your feet up and watch this amazing thing you're about to see now, our team are going to be planning for a whole bunch of events that we're going to put on digitally over the coming months. For now, this one's on us, it's free. But you know, everything that we do costs money. And at the moment, we don't have the same income streams that we've got. So if you can spare a few pennies, a few shekels, if you can click donate online, that'll be really wonderful. We'd be so grateful for it. If you can do that, that's great. But either way, please sit back and enjoy. We'll see you again soon.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michelle Heyer. I'm the Holocaust Education Programmer, and for those of you who have not been to JW3 before, we welcome you. And we'd like to inform you that we have a full Holocaust education programme here throughout the year. In fact, next Wednesday evening, we have a visiting speaker from America called Jack Hirsch, who will be talking about his father, who escaped 2 death marches. It's another incredible story. Tickets can be booked online or through our box office. I'd like to give a special welcome to Dame Stephanie this evening. Thank you so much for coming to JW3. 80 years ago, Dame Stephanie came to the UK with her elder sister on the Kindertransport at the age of 5 years old, leaving her parents and arriving in the UK with just a small suitcase. As Dame Stephanie states in her book, it took some time for me to adjust to the fact that my foster parents in the UK had actually taken upon themselves to save my life. But once she had digested this fact, a simple resolution took root in her heart. She had to make sure that hers was a life worth saving. Dame Stephanie went on to leave a lifetime of achievement and philanthropy, giving women the opportunity in business, initially finding the software company Freelance Programmers. Her successful career has allowed her to give something back to society, and she has donated most of her wealth towards projects connected with autism. We look forward to hearing about you and your family in those really difficult times. And we will be selling signed copies of Dame Stephanie's book, Let It Go, after the event. There will also be an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. May I remind you to turn off your mobile phones. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are marking 80 years from the beginning of World War II, and so it's really a privilege for me to talk about my family's experience. We did, as things triumph over adversity, and it was a personal triumph which was shared, I'm sure, by many people. I shall tell what happened to my Jewish father, Gentile mother, and my sister and I, who were offensively called crossbreeds, an occasionally subhuman animal. And we were torn from our home in Germany and came to Britain as exiles in 1939. And as we consider this century's migration crisis, our story may serve as a commentary on love and hate. We started off with the 4 of us living in a nice house in Dortmund, near Berlin. My sister Renata attending a school with the children of other bourgeois families. We never know what life holds for us. If all had gone according to plan, we would have remained in that comfortable, conventional life forever. My father was a young judge who had imagined that his position would allow him to fight the evils of Nazism. But by the time I was born in 1933, doors were starting to be closed in his face, partly because of his Jewish ethnicity, and partly because of his open contempt for National Socialism. Again and again, we were forced to move from city to city, and then from country to country. We eventually settled in my mother's home city of Vienna, and for a while my father had work again, apparently in a coffee house, though what he was doing there I have no idea, because he was a most impractical man and I can't imagine him working in a coffee shop. My sister Renata remembered seeing Hitler marching into the city in March 1938. By my 5th birthday, a few weeks before Kristallnacht, it was clear that Jewish families faced catastrophe. The one thing I remember from Vienna, and all my memories are, of a small child, not of a sociologist, but the one thing I do remember is my mother and I always going to meet my sister from school, and she explained to me that it was really very important that we met her every day, because she was starting to get a lot of anti-Semitism. The children were throwing stones at her, but she had a kind teacher who used to let her out early so that she could get away before having dirty Jew shouted at her and, as I say, stones thrown. By 1939, the doors were gradually closing, and when my parents heard about the Kindertransport, they made the desperate decision that we should be sent to England into the arms of strangers in order to save our lives. The Kindertransport trains had been running for about 6 months by then, but it was not a simple matter. Forms had to be filled in, documents stamped, permits queued for at, my mother said, deliberately inconvenient times, guarantees provided. And we spent several weeks in a children's home, and I asked her years later, what were we doing in the children's home? And she sort of said, I could not cope with getting all the bureaucracy, dealing with the bureaucracy, if I was still looking after you, so I put you in a children's home for a few weeks so that I could cope with the Kindertransport paperwork. So she devoted herself full time to dealing with the Nazi and, she said, British bureaucracy. There wasn't any limit to the number of children permitted to be rescued. Nothing was ever published. Britain capped its input at 10,000 children over the 8 months from December 38 to September 39, and compare that number with the sort of numbers that Britain talks about admitting today. While some children had to go into hostels, the refugee children's movement had found my sister and I some foster parents in the Midlands of England who guaranteed that the two of us would not be a burden on the state. Thank you, Guy and Ruby Smith. We call them Uncle and Auntie. And they nurtured us as they would their own. I was very lucky. And I am their child in all but birth. Everyone told us to be grateful. Aren't you lucky? Indeed, I am grateful. But I also loved them dearly, cared for them in their old age, and honour their memories as I do all the uncles and aunties who saw us children through those terrible times. The fact that people that I did not know and did not know me saved us made a deep impression on me. Both our parents survived, though I never really bonded with them again, and there's a sadness about that. Let me tell you a bit about Greta, my mother, Austrian mother. She was the younger daughter of an established Gentile family. She also managed her desperate escape from Vienna to England. And again, years later, I asked her, well, how did you get out? And she said that she had bribed her way across Europe on the basis that she was an Austrian citizen, and she adjusted, and she actually wore a swastika to sort of move around properly. She, at one time, bribed her way using the fur coat that was on her back. But she did get herself to England and certainly had no intention of staying behind without the family. What happened to her when she finally got to England? She was penniless, homeless. She arrived 4 days before war was declared. And the regulations allowed her to work either in domestic service or in agriculture. And she chose domestic service and worked in somebody else's nice house for some years before becoming a resident cook in a hostel for 40 schoolgirls and finishing up as a teacher of geography and needlework. Not significantly, she never taught German. In 1951, she and I went through the naturalization program together. It's an odd word, isn't it? To naturalize somebody. I was registered as a British minor, and my mother took the oath of allegiance in front of a justice of the peace. To further ease our integration, we took the opportunity to change our name from an impronounceable Buchtal, or unpronounceable for English ears, and we chose Brooke to honour that quintessentially English poet, Rupert Brooke. And we dropped the E because we thought it was a little bit pretentious, so it was just Brooke. And I found the change of name empowering. One summer, she and I went to Vienna together, partly for her to search for family and friends, partly to dig up the silver which had been buried in the garden, and we did get it. We made a grim train journey across Europe, sort of really burdened down with expectation, before finally emerging in the historic city from which we had left 20 years before. And I was accosted kindly by a couple who asked, "Are you from the camps?" Vienna had not seen a face like mine for many years. There were no Jews left there at all. But I looked round at its gracious avenues and grand palaces, elegant squares. And while previously I had wept sentimentally on hearing Viennese music, I now realized in a flash that the city meant nothing for me, and I was just an English schoolgirl on holiday. And the weight of my past really fell from my shoulders. Later, my mother bought a little terrace house in a suburb of London and equipped it with second-hand bits and pieces and utility furniture which was available via government coupon system for the needy, of course, which we were. And she paid the mortgage by taking lodgers, borrowed the deposit, and by the end of her life, in a modest way, she was once again no longer in need, quite comfortable, and just, she said, the first time since early in her marriage. Still, she lived frugally. From 1961 on, she volunteered for the human rights charity Amnesty International. Was my mother happy? I remember her inconsolable tears when one of the few things that she had from the past got broken. Her will asked us to scatter her ashes in the Vienna woods. And that perhaps says something about how she felt about her long exile. My main memory of that filial visit when we took her ashes there was of my sister's preoccupation with evaluating the likely role of people we saw in the street who would have been adults in the 30s when we were in such trouble. And she was saying to herself, what were you doing when they were throwing stones at me? Going back to my father, he finished the war in the British Army. And as an adult male German, he had been briefly interned before being deported, as happened to all plus 16-year-olds, in June 1940 to Australia. He went from Liverpool on the transport ship Dunera, along with around 2,000 other German refugees, Jewish refugees in the main, and more than 40 German and Italian prisoners of war, with whom they apparently had a truce for the duration of the journey. They were guarded by soldiers who ran amok, locked the internees below deck for most of the 57-day journey, stole their valuables and threw their suitcases overboard. And the conditions on that grossly overcrowded voyage were so appalling that, to Britain's everlasting credit, Parliament found time in the midst of the war to debate the scandal. And the official files were closed for 100 years, so no one until 2040 yet knows all that happened on that journey. They called it a hell ship, they called her. And that those deportees who survived the journey, 2 died and 50 were hospitalized, then travelled to an internment camp in Hay in New South Wales, so in the middle of an inhospitable nowhere that the security fence was really unnecessary because there was nowhere to go to. The inmates made the best of their plight. Many of them studied. They printed their own money. They developed an unofficial university with remarkable cultural and educational programs. And they virtually governed themselves. It was as if their intellectual horizons had been widened by the confined space. In May 1941, partly as a result of the outcry in Britain, as families heard, despite mail being censored, about the iniquity of their treatment, a substantial number of the internees were released, and some 800 stayed in Australia and made a significant difference to the cultural, scientific and artistic life of this very young nation. But my father chose to return to Britain and joined what is called the Pioneer Corps, which was a sort of an auxiliary force that supported the armed forces, the acting soldiers. And they dubbed themselves the King's most loyal enemy aliens. He started off digging ditches and such like, and then translating for prisoners of war, then finally heading a prisoner of war hospital used to treat several hundred mentally ill prisoners of war. And some VIP visitors were surprised to find a lowly sergeant running such a large establishment, but that was the highest rank available to a non-Brit. Hitler had taken nationality away from Jewish families, so we'd all arrived stateless. But we received some modicum of paperwork, the so-called Nansen passport, Nansen the explorer, from Britain, basically formally recognizing us as displaced persons registered here, and for years I travelled on that Nansen passport. We were categorized as enemy aliens, and then when people realized that we were just children, they changed it to friendly enemy aliens. And post-war, because we were still there, just to friendly aliens. How glad I was later to receive the reassurance of a British passport. And the shifting identity captures hate and happiness, villains and good guys. The fifth columnist, the suspected terrorist, the refugee, the unwanted migrant. They present a useful outlet for people's fears. Anytime one of us moved, even for an overnight stay, we had to report in advance to our local police station and then register at the new police station on arrival. Adults were subject to curfew and had to hurry home at sundown, while we children could carry on playing. The International Red Cross handled 25-word messages that got some family greetings through to us. The one I received, which was from my grandmother in Holland, who was in hiding throughout the war, that is now in the Red Cross Museum. My Jewish star and other things dating from those years are in the Holocaust museums of Nottingham and London. And Ruth, the doll that travelled with me on that 2.5-day journey, Ruth is safely in the V&A's Museum of Childhood. After the war, my parents were free, in theory, to return to the homestead from which they had been driven 6 years earlier. My father was desperate to rebuild his life in Germany. I mean, his legal career could not be revived elsewhere. My mother saw it differently. It was unthinkable that her husband should do anything else but build a new life from scratch in England, just as she had done. And the outcome was to modernize, predictable. They divorced. And my father returned to Germany soon after, well, more or less immediately. Shortly before the German surrender, he had transferred to the American Army of Occupation, which needed educated German speakers to help with the post-war administration of what remained of the country. Germany had entirely broken down. The contrast to orderly Britain couldn't have been more nightmarish. There was no money, no power, no water. The only semblance of civil structure was the crude military authority of the occupying Allies. I was there for some weeks and remember seeing the people coming out, living in the cellars of bombed buildings, bartering sex for food, using cigarettes as currency, black marketeer, white slaver. There was no warmth in anyone's faces. Most were just blank from hunger and fear. And the mood was certainly not one of guilt, but rather the overpowering sense of defeat. And after 6 years of the most devastating war in human history, this was my first glimpse of its utter dehumanizing horror and destruction. My father was a researcher for the Nuremberg trials, including work on the excuse me. Let me just have a drink. Can't do it. It's quite difficult to talk about some of these things. My father was a researcher at the Nuremberg trials, and one of the things he had to research was the role of Eichmann and the Wannsee Conference, which agreed on the final solution to the Nazi policy to murder the Jews of Europe. My sister and I sat in on a few sessions, the famous Justice trial, on which he was also working. And most of the proceedings went over my 14-year-old head. But I could understand what was involved, what was at stake. Yet the accused did not look like monsters. In 1955, Austria re-established itself as a sovereign state and declared itself permanently neutral, though its definition of neutral has changed a bit over the years. Germany also made impressive efforts to come to terms with its Nazi past. All in all, some 50 billion euro was paid as reparation, plus last December an extra 2 million euro to surviving Kindertransport children. And since many of us are no longer in need, many of us are dedicating our little windfall to the Safe Passage charity, which looks after today's child refugees. Post-war, the United Restitution Organization had lawyers dealing with all that reparation compensation for stolen property, so much for lost parent, so much for, in my case, lost education. I started off going through that process, only to realize that I didn't really want my hated oppressors' support. And I've been lucky, very lucky. And as an adult who was no longer a victim, I pulled out of the negotiations. My sister, who was older and wiser, never started them. A lot of people felt that at that time, restitution was a bit like blood money. But let me finish on a positive that testified to our Kindertransport experience. Me at age 5 clutching the hand of my 9-year-old sister. It's hard, after 80 years, to be certain how many of the remembered details of the journey are real, and how many I've added to my mental picture from other sources. For example, I've read that some of the trains were sealed. But surely one boy in our carriage kept getting off the train on its many unscheduled stops, because he was the one that kept being sick, and I mean every 10 minutes. Was that just a dream, a nightmare? We slept on strips of corrugated cardboard, on the floor, on the benches, and believe it or not, in the overhead luggage racks. I can't remember what we ate. I do remember the occasional frightening interruptions from uniformed guards who were particularly nasty, as I remember. And I recall vividly the cold, oily, inky smell of the sea when we finally reached the channel. I vaguely remember the nauseous night crossing between Hook van Holland and Harwich. But what about my sense that when we finally arrived by train at Liverpool Street Station, the platform was silent? Was the July weather outside, July the 6th, was it really grey? It seemed somehow implausible. And perhaps I've merely projected the numbness of my emotions onto the past. Nevertheless, that is how my mind has preserved it. We spilled out onto the platform, 1,000 children, dirty, tired, fractious, but silent. I think we're just traumatized. We had numbered labels hanging round our necks, as if we were lost property. In a way, perhaps we were. Renata also had an expensive Leica camera slung around her person, because we were allowed to bring out a camera, but not allowed to bring out any money. And that was later sold, of course. And we waited to be claimed, sitting on straw-filled mattresses in a cavernous hall, which I once went back to see what it was like, and it had been knocked down, so it had long been demolished. The Kindertransport organised its trains from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the Free City of Danzig. Each train had about 1,000 children, aged 5 to 16, some small 17-year-olds also snuck in, with just 2 adults per train. There were just also some girls, aged 16 plus, so not eligible to travel, who were looking after some babies. and they had volunteered to travel under a concession dependent on their return to what they must have known was almost certain death. Courage has many forms. I've always honoured the sheer heroism of those young people. And I recently learnt of one of them. This is Lily Reichenfeld. She was one of them, aged 18, who made 2 such journeys of love. She was guaranteed her return from a non-Jewish friend, and she did go back, and Theresienstadt and Auschwitz followed, then oblivion. Lily Reichenfeld. When it comes to the Kindertransport, let me formally thank the Jewish and Christian activists who set up the Kindertransport, the Society of Friends, the Quakers, who kept it going when it ran out of money, the many, many volunteers without which it would never have happened. It was the largest ever recorded migration of children. My father had taught us some useful phrases. So I could say, slow combustion stove, very useful, and Wein screen Viper. But I didn't, excuse me, know how to ask to go to the bathroom. Of course, pain allows you to grow. But many exiles suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, or depression, or both. Some exiles' psychological scars were so deep as to be carried across to their children. And my own exile brought problems of identity, which took 6 years of psychoanalysis at the renowned Tavistock Clinic to clear. The number of the dead is not the sole measure of the Jewish tragedy. There's the vast unhappiness which engulfed so many who survived. We carry the desperate and self-destructive guilt of being a survivor. Survivor guilt seems so counterintuitive. Surely one should be happy when so many others died and we're still alive. But if the depression which follows survivor guilt has any lesson, it is compassion, and so it proved for me. Helping others is one of the best treatments for it. For decades, I avoided setting foot on German soil. And then as I matured, realized that it was precisely for people like me to reach out. So joined what is now the Anglo-German Association, and that preluded the European movement, which was really at that time directed at avoiding future wars and within Europe. And you can guess how I feel about Brexit. My terror had been deep-rooted. I saw one of the many public information films that were compulsory viewing in post-war Germany, and that was about Auschwitz, and I fainted. whether it was the thought that I might so easily have been one of those victims, or some other form of survivor guilt, or just simple, empathetic horror of the suffering of all those human beings, I don't know. And even now, I get panic attacks and nightmares after seeing pictures of the concentration camps, and have to be careful about dwelling on such subjects. It's still more than I can bear. Years later still, at a time when the National Front, was enjoying a brief spell of headline-making popularity, I was driving along a country road in Buckinghamshire and noticed a huge swastika painted on the outside wall of a remote farmhouse. And my first reaction was of horrified panic. Old fears were reawakened. My next was to take control of the situation. I found the farmer, told him how offensive the symbol was to me, but he shrugged and said it was nothing to do with him and he couldn't see it anyway because it was on the outside of the wall. So I visited the local police station, where they in turn shrugged and said it was nothing to do with them. Finally, I realized that there was only one thing for it. I bought a large tin of paint, got up at 4 o'clock in the morning without involving my husband so as not to involve him in my delinquency, and simply painted over the offending symbol. We exiles tried hard to fit in. So many things were different. The plumbing. How cold the winter was without central heating. Not duvets, but eiderdowns. And they were not dear children to be hung out of the window to air. The Brits put milk in their tea. They eat fish paste sandwiches and other strange foods. They use saucepans rather than cooking pots. Write their sevens differently, even knit differently. Renata, my sister, knits to the German way. I knit like a true-born Englishwoman. An appearance was another disparity. Not racial, but clothes, which Hitler had allowed us to bring out. Mine came in 4 sizes, for me and for me to grow into, and also for my sister, 4 years older, and for her to grow into. So that although she and I were not always living together, I was landed with 4 very Germanic winter coats that I had to row my way through. They had this green tweed with grey astrakhan collars, very Germanic, which I did not want to wear. Then there was language. Some exiles became bilingual. Others merely retained their German accent or intonation or word order, or sort of muddled up thank you and no thank you. I deliberately forgot my German, and most of the younger Kindertransportees speak only English. Let me concentrate for a minute on my sister. She never settled as well as I did, and remained an exile in spirit. And as an adult, she declined several Home Office invitations to apply for British citizenship, until the Home Office final letter suggested that if she did not wish to become a British citizen, and she had been to school here, she should perhaps return to where she'd come from. And that she certainly did not want to do. So she upped sticks and took herself off to Australia on a £10 assisted passage, as we had in those days. And then, after only 6 months, she applied for Australian citizenship. And I've often wondered about that. She didn't choose to come to Britain. The exile was done to us children. And as an adult, she too had ceased to be a victim. She could make things happen rather than have things happen to her. And she chose Australia and sublimated the trauma of her own childhood by helping children, including many of the Vietnamese boat children, into adoptive and foster families. She adopted a baby girl and fostered 2 brothers, just as we 2 sisters had been fostered a generation back. I also followed the family tradition of public service, then started my own business to get around some of the problems of sexism of the time. So my childhood trauma was transformed into entrepreneurship. So all in all, our family did triumph over adversity. It would have been good also to be able to say that we led to a vibrant new dynasty in England. But not one of us refreshed the gene pool. My father resettled in the land of his birth. Amazingly, after his round-the-world travels, his 1933 dismissal letters was found among his papers when he died. My sister migrated to Australia. My mother and I remained here, though she would have never done anything but scored very high in any measure of nostalgia. She never understood the British sense of humour. My only child died without issue. But 3 things have driven my life, each the result of that 1939 escape from the Holocaust. I learned to deal with change, indeed eventually to welcome change, and that's useful in the digital age. Secondly, I determined early in my life, and everybody was saying, aren't you lucky, aren't you lucky? But I did determine early on that I would make mine a life that was worth saving. And finally, my love for this country, one of the very few that would let us children in, is with a passion perhaps only someone who has lost their human rights can feel. Thank you very much. I will take questions, and there are some young people who will give you a microphone. I can only just see you. If somebody can put the lights up, great. Who would like to start with the questions about either my journey or my later life? Yes, somebody here, please.
You mentioned about your education was stifled. How did you manage to get into like the computer industry? Because obviously you had obviously education was a stumbling block, and also being a woman must have been a stumbling block too.
Well, I did go to, my education was, I started off going to a little village school, and then this was in the Midlands of England, and Auntie and Uncle were a bit snobbish, and I started to talk with a Birmingham accent, and they didn't like that. So they took me out of that school and sent me to a little Roman Catholic convent, which is called St Paul's, not the big St Paul's in London, which is a wonderful public school, but St Paul's Convent in Sutton Coldfield. And from there I got a scholarship to grammar school. And I started working at the age of 18 and studied at night school to get my honours maths degree. What happened was that I did get into a very good employer, which was the Post Office Research Station at Dollis Hill, NW2. And that really encouraged me to go on working. They gave me masses of opportunity until I started to get a little bit ambitious. And then the men sort of realized that this wasn't just, I was quite pretty, that it wasn't just a pretty woman, girl, that she was actually after some of their jobs. And then I began to really meet some sexism. My boss declined to put me up for promotion. People said overtly, I would never give this graduate position to a woman, never. I mean, this is in 1951 or something like that. So it was quite tough, but I did become quite assertive. I was horrified to find that there were two salary scales in those days. This was the public service, of course. One salary scale for men and one lower scale for women. And strong young men used to offer to carry my equipment for me. I used to reply very aggressively, I believe in equal pay and will carry my own things. Nowadays, of course, I say, oh, how kind. But I was a mathematician, that was my love, my passion. And I sort of just about realized that I wasn't going to be able to do anything brilliant in mathematics when the computers came along. So I was very early in the computer industry. I'm in the Computer Museum of Bletchley Park in California. I am a museum piece. So it stood me in good stead. You needed mathematics in the early days of computing. It's been a wonderful career for me. I still have some links with computing. For example, I fairly recently funded the Oxford Internet Institute, which is looking at the internet, not from a technical point of view, but from the point of view of the social, economic, legal and ethical issues of the internet. So I still hope to be able to contribute. I'm using robots to teach autistic children in one of my charities. So there are ways in which I'm not a pioneer anymore, but I'm what's called an early adopter. Right. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Yes, at the front here, please.
I assume CH stands for Companion of Honour.
It does indeed.
And can you tell us the citation?
Yes, Companions of Honour, there are only 65 worldwide, so I'm enormously proud of it. I didn't know that there was anything higher than a dameship, of which I'm also proud. The citation was for IT, entrepreneurship and philanthropy.
Exactly what you are.
Thank you. Yes.
Did your parents live to see your success? Your sister, I assume, but did your parents?
My mother did, yes. She wasn't a scientist. I don't know the extent to which she appreciated it. As you will find from the book, I had a difficult relationship with her. And some of her friends within the last few years, have sort of said, I know you write about her, and I write very honestly throughout the book, you know, warts and all. But your mother was enormously proud of you. And that I didn't know. And this is why we always have to tell people, you know, I love you, or I'm proud of you, and that's marvellous. Because I didn't know that she had that reaction at all. What am I proud of? It's not really the money that I made. I think it's much more to do with not having let my refugee start drive my whole life. The impact is there, but I'm defined as an entrepreneur, as a philanthropist, not as a refugee. Right at the back, please.
Hello. Well, first of all, I hope that the stool that you're sitting on isn't as uncomfortable as it looked.
I'm well padded.
Good for you. I saw your television programme where you were interviewed on Hard Talk, and I was inspired by you very much. And now, you talked in that programme about your personal life with your son, and perhaps this isn't the forum for it, but I was going to offer you that opportunity if you wanted to take it, to give us some insight into your philanthropy in that area.
Well, I've said that you never know what life holds for you, and that's why we should live each day as if it's your last, because you really don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Our much wanted son was born in 1962. Beautiful baby, very easy baby, which was lovely for me because I was still working from home. And I had really sort of 6 or 12 months of the happiest period of my life ever. And then something dreadful happened. Over a period of days or weeks, he lost the little speech that he had, and turned from this placid, easy baby into a wild, unmanageable toddler. Not the terrible twos. He was profoundly autistic. Having lost speech, he never spoke again. And that started a period of extreme stress and sorrow. He became larger, still very wild. By the time he was getting into his teens, he was very wild, and was, I just couldn't really cope with him anymore, and had a good old-fashioned breakdown. 1 in 4 people in Britain do have mental health problems, and I certainly did. And I finished up in hospital and was off work for a year, so it was, you know, quite serious. And because I was his carer, Giles also had to go into hospital, and basically he never came out. Except that after many years, he began to lose some of his human rights. And by that time my business was a bit successful, and we decided to get him out of hospital and look after him again ourselves, but this time with paid help, because we could afford paid help. And that led to my very first charity. So Giles, our son Giles, was the first resident in the first home of my first charity. And that charity now looks after 300 people with autism, adults with autism, and very profound care needs, and keeps an overview of another 150 who, 1 day a week, who basically they manage to live on their own, but we keep an overview of them. So that charity, I'm enormously proud of it. It cost one hell of a lot, not in financial terms, but in this business of trying to build up a charity, get it into professional management, get it sustainable, and at the same time care day by day for my very difficult Jazzy. My second charity was really the jewel in my crown, which was a school for autistic children. I'd gone to the States to have a look at the school there and to see if it would help my first charity. And I saw there a school where they were getting such good results that I thought, oh, well, yes, of course, they've got their pupils there much easier than my child's. And then I looked at the intake of the 5-year-olds coming in or something, and they were just as difficult as my child's. And so I came back to this country, that was the end of '97, determined really to provide such a facility in this country. It took me 22 months from concept to actually opening in September 1999. And we opened with 28 staff and 2 pupils. But 8 months later we'd got 9 pupils, and since then we're now up to about 90 plus pupils, and over 500 staff, and as I've mentioned, a couple of robot teachers. So I'm trying to, that's 20 years ago now, it really is. It cost me 30 million, that project. So it's a major project. And it's just announced that it is about to start looking for a site for a second school. And there's no reason why. People are very generous. They will fundraise for it, and it will be open in 3-4 years' time, perhaps, with another 90 children being cared for and educated. Children with autism are educated. They learn in a different way. They learn from show, not tell. Most of them don't have language, but they can use simple computers. They use iPads with little icons saying they want to drink or they want food or whatever it is. I'm enormously proud of that school. But the most strategic charity that I've set up is a medical research charity to really try and find out what is autism, what is it as distinct from what it looks like. I mean, I can recognize an autistic child the other side of the playground, but we really don't know much about what it is. And so I set up this charity. It's called Autistica. It's now 15 years old, and that is the largest autism research charity in Europe, though there are, of course, organisations like Welcome and so on who are really responsible for the heavyweight stuff. But a small charity as we are, I suppose, can do all sorts of experiments. So I spend my time with charities. I support another 70 projects that other people are doing, mainly in startups. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm good at starting things. The more successful they are, the bigger they are, the less I have to contribute, and so I back away. Thank you. Here, please.
You say you've been to Germany many times since the war. Do you think the 3rd and 4th generation Germans are a different people to those who are in the war?
I'm very glad you asked that, actually. I haven't been all that often, but the young Germans I meet today are a different people. To them, the Holocaust is some distant history, and they really are amazed at the emphasis that Brits still put on it. I think they are different, and they're better for it. Would you like to comment?
Bring back to Germany, I thought.
Back there, the lady in green.
You talked a little bit about your experience with tackling your identity and having therapy around what you described very briefly as issues around your identity. I wonder if you'd elaborate a little bit.
I went through a stage when I was about 20 or something like that. I was deeply unhappy. I was doing well in business, and not in business, but in science, and going through a series of totally unsuitable boyfriends, you know, that sort of stage that one has. Maybe everybody has that. But I was pretty unhappy, suicidal at times, just not coming to terms with the English woman that I had become, and feeling that I was not fit not fit to marry. That was one of the things. I just didn't seem that it was right for me to marry. And it wasn't until I went back to Vienna that I realized that Vienna meant nothing to me. And in fact, I phoned my now husband from Vienna and said, let's get married when I get back, which we did 6 weeks later. Incidentally, we are now about to celebrate 60 years of marriage. I've forgotten what the question was.
You've answered it. I just wondered if what being Jewish contributed to your identity, and if that was any part of the therapy you had to have.
Yes, I think it was part of that identity. Let me tell a little story. When Israel started, everyone was very excited about it, and people sort of said, are you going to Israel? And I sort of would say, no, I'm not. I don't really feel Jewish. I am Jewish, but I don't feel Jewish. And then they sort of said, well, Israel's a beautiful country. Why don't you just go as a tourist? Well, I couldn't go as a tourist. I'm a Jew. So one has that really torn between the two. So yes, it was an important part. I really know very little about the Jewish faith. I'm interested in spirituality. I'm interested in the non-material aspects of life. Love, nature, friendship, music, art, animals. And that's the nearest I ever get to any faith.
We'll just take one more question, and then we'll
There was one floating around here somewhere. Yes, this gentleman right at the front.
Would you like to tell us?
Hold on, you need a mic.
Could you perhaps tell us some details of the successful business with which you made your fortune?
Ah, how long have you got? I was very early in the software industry, but my drive was more a sexist drive, that I wanted to provide opportunities for women to work in the software industry, rather than just be pushed to the side and all the good jobs go for the men. And some of that is still necessary today. So it started off as a crusade. Minute number one in my company's annals was that it shall be the employment policy of this company to provide jobs for women with children. And then, as I began to be a bit more sophisticated, and that changed to careers for women with children. And then equal opportunities legislation came in 1975, and you couldn't have a pro-female policy like that. And so that had to change to careers for people, I think, with domestic responsibilities and so on. But we became really innovators in the way in which we worked. We didn't do any vast innovation as in computing. We just edged it along as most of us do in science. But we did things in a different way. We had a whole lot of people working from home, using only the simple telephone. We would send our programs which were punched on. You would start off writing a flow chart defining a task to be done, and then that would go to a data center to be punched up, and about a week later it would actually get onto the computer. That slow process meant that there was a vast amount of intellectual checking and emphasis on accuracy of programming. I loved it. I love it. I just, it's like an enormous puzzle. I can remember employing somebody and she was asking a very, very high salary. I said, what makes you justify this salary? And she said, I don't make mistakes. Because most of the things that you do in programming is you are making mistakes. You have to learn to pick them out and remedy them. And that's a good practice in life. None of us is perfect. We have to actually learn to live with what we've got.
I just want to say a huge thank you. We've heard a remarkable story this evening. It's included so many different factors, and I think, well, I've read the book. I want, if any of you would like to, it's only £9.99, so we've got plenty over there. And Dame Stephanie has very kindly offered to sign some books as well. So if you would like to purchase, we'll be here. And I think we should also thank her again. So.